Today we have with us the Right Honourable John Lytton, the 5th Earl of Lytton, a Chartered Surveyor, peer and a member of House of Lords and patron of the Chartered Association of Building Engineers. He succeeded his father in the earldom in 1985 and sponsored and spoke in the House on the Current Party Wall Act 1996. He lost his seat in the House of Lords after the passing of House of Lords Act 1999. However, on 11th of May 2011, he won a hereditary peer by-election and regained his seat there, where he sits as a crossbencher. With many interests listed in this, in his House of Lords biography, not least housing and planning. With many interests listed, as I mentioned, in the House of Lords biography, not least housing and planning, a descendant of the poet and adventurer Lord Byron via his daughter, Ada Lovelace, who was arguably the world's first computer programmer. Lord Lytton has taken his Byronic descent to heart and has contributed to the Newstead Byron Society Review. He has also spoken before the Byron Society of his family of history. He was educated at Downside School and graduated from the University of Reading with a BSc Honours degree in Estate Management in 1972. After spending 30 years in the Inland Revenue Valuation Office and some years with surveying firms, Permit Brown and Co. and Cubitt and West, he set up his practice of John Lytton and Co. Chartered Surveyors. Now works part-time in the construction industry with Lawrence Foot and Partners as a consultant. So without further ado, I will pass it over to John to take it from here.
Thank you, Rima. That's a wonderful introduction. I think my stint in the Inland Revenue Valuation Office, that was when I was the gamekeeper as opposed to the poacher that I am now, was a little bit shorter than what I heard you say, but it was nearly 7 years, and that was long enough. Now, thank you very much for inviting me on. What I want to actually talk about today is an aspect of what I see as a series of challenges that are being laid down to private property rights. I want to explain that this is on a very broad frontage, and also I'd like to give my opinion as to why that matters. If I can come sort of right up to the present, we've recently in the House of Lords been discussing the product security and telecommunications infrastructure bill, and that has made a series of changes to the 2017 Electronic Communications Code. The pressures for these seem to have been aimed at getting a better rollout of 4G, the existing 4G, and also 5G as matters go forward into this new world of smart meters and potentially automated vehicles and the Internet of Things. So having this better and more efficient and latest generation of telecommunications is actually a very important mission, and I think everybody recognises that. In parallel, that there have been some significant changes within the telecoms industry, so that you now have network providers, and you also have separately, because they've now been spun off, a series of firms that are if you like, the tenants and the operators of the mast sites. So you now have three categories of people. You have a telecoms network operator, or network operator for short, the mast company operators, or mastcos as we refer to them for shorthand, and the site providers, who are the original landlords of the site. Now, substantial government money, many hundreds of millions of pounds, is being put into the rollout of the telecoms world. And so there's actually an important treasury stake in all this in terms of public money. And the claim has been made and was made prior to 2017, that private property rights were getting too expensive. In other words, the rents were too high. That notwithstanding the previous 20 years, which the rents actually paid were largely set by the network operators who then were operating their own sites. So more important to see where that's coming from in this context. They also were saying that they should be treated the same as utility companies, so gas, water, electricity, that sort of thing, and that they should have the same powers as the utility companies and also not pay more for the rights to put in utilities than those utility companies. And they presented all this as being part of the impediments to the rollout of 4G and 5G, which, as I say, was government policy. Now, the Telecoms Code refers to what are known as code operators, but the code operator has now expanded to not only just the network operator, but also the mast site operator as well. And they now have powers of compulsion. In other words, they can procure the rights that they need to install and operate their services. The operators, starting with the network operators, as we say, were originally running the mast sites themselves, and now the operators and the mast cos, talking about being treated as utilities was all very well, but they actually weren't subject to the regulatory requirements and performance. So in particular, things like the duty to supply, which you may be aware is applicable to certainly water undertakers. So that was a problem. And the second thing was that the regulation was seen as regulation generally was seen as potentially ineffective. In other words, more attuned to keeping the whole operation of the industry on the road rather than necessarily protecting individual citizens. And I think the low confidence in regulation generally is probably particularly exemplified by the fact that it has seemingly been impossible to stop sewage treatment utilities, for one thing, from discharging largely untreated sewage into streams and coastal waters. And that, of course, has been a serious problem. So cynics might see the whole argument by the site cos and the network companies as being a ploy to gain some sort of commercial advantage. Now, the effects of the 2017 code alteration have been fairly substantial. Governments at the time said they thought there was going to be about a 40% reduction, 30%, 40% reduction in rents paid for the sites. In fact, the average is at about 63%. So it's very much more substantial than they predicted. And it affects all sorts of people. It's not just commercial people with lots of money, but it's things like sports clubs, it's village halls, it's churches with an array on their church tower, and that sort of thing. And these site cos, some people refer to them as aggregators because they have portfolios of these different sites. And for instance, Vodafone sold off its portfolio to a company, and other network operators have done the same. One of them is a company that is based in San Diego, if you please, and it does raise certainly questions with me as to what our primary mast infrastructure is doing in the hands of people that are not necessarily controllable under UK jurisdiction. The effect of the changes that we discussed in the what I call the PSTI bill, that's the Product Security and Telecommunications Installations Bill, the one we've most recently been dealing with, is that it extends the provisions of the code into the area of the 1954 Act. So it starts cutting across existing agreements, and in particular there'd been a problem with regards to interim rents under the Land Tent Act 1954. It's important to remember that if you have one of these mast operators on your property, it's not at all easy to remove them. They have rights to remain, and it's only under certain circumstances you can get rid of them. So they are effectively capable of standing in the way of a landowner's future proposals. So, for instance, additional floors on a block of flats, a redevelopment of an older commercial site, that sort of thing. So there is that contingent problem that is not really being factored into the arrangements as they stand. Looking at what the rents were before they started being reduced wholesale, I cannot help feeling that they were actually pretty small here in comparison with the overall costs of provision, as a percentage. But there was also this principle of fairness and equity, because the government decided that there shouldn't be a market value approach to this thing, but it should be based on what they call land value. In other words, it should be assume a no network situation that approximates to, in valuation terms, to existing use value. The trouble with existing use value is that it is but a single component part of market value. And whilst market value has a definition in the RICS Red Book, Manual of Appraisal and Valuation, existing use value as such doesn't, and for obvious reasons, because it means whatever it is being used for at a particular time and the value derived from that. So it's actually a very haphazard approach to the whole thing. My feeling is that part of this was driven by the construction side of these, the construction and operational side of these things, rather than by companies looking at the property aspect of the thing. And I can't help feeling that the various the departments involved, the government department involved with this, perhaps didn't have a full understanding of the valuation principles behind it. It would be difficult to imagine a conservative government having a political dislike of private property. And so one has to ask, was this something that was just put forward as a means of justifying something else? In other words, looking for a scapegoat to set up as being a lever towards something else. And if that is the case, who will be blamed for the next failure of delivery as things go forward? Will it be a political scapegoat? Will it be some other scapegoat? Will the network operator start accusing the site co's of not delivering, or what is it? We don't know. It's not, of course, just down to rents, but it's also a matter of the access to a fair adjudication. The work of the upper tribunal in dealing with contested cases has to a degree been circumscribed, because there are certain things that it can't actually take into account. And there is a degree of considerable effort involved in trying to unravel the true value of a deal for any particular site, which it is not in a position to investigate. So the net result of that is that there's a risk of things being subject to a sort of shortcut. The alternative which the government has suggested is some sort of alternative dispute resolution. The difficulty about that is you're dealing with some pretty unequal parties. You're dealing with a well-funded MassCo that's paying rents to its SiteCo site provider, and they have a lot of government money behind them, a lot of government impetus behind them. It's difficult to see how, if one went to mediation or something of that sort, how one would get round that inequality. And if you go to arbitration, how do you stop them, one side effortlessly outgunning the weaker party? So I'm afraid to say that I don't have the confidence in ADR the government seems to be suggesting. So looking beyond that, there are various things that sit alongside that. first of all, there is a challenge more widely to the idea of including hope value in compensation for compulsory acquisitions of one sort or another. And we are talking about a form of compulsory acquisition right here. And if you have no hope value, therefore, that's another aspect of what everybody would regard as market value, part of the aspirations of the market, which is being eliminated. And the processes don't go through the same rigor that the 60 years of compulsory purchase compensation, which laid down various codes since the 1960s, would have you go through. And that's, I think, partly because they want to try and speed things up. But that comes at a cost, and I think it comes at a cost, a degree of justice and a degree of compromising of fairness. There are other aspects of that that are also in play. For instance, last Friday, there was a private member's bill moved by none other than Dr. Liam Fox MP, who will be known to you, of course. And he was moving a private member's bill called the Electricity and Gas Transmission Compensation Bill. And what apparently has happened in his Somerset constituency, there is a proposal to create an interconnector between effectively an overhead power line system between the upgraded Hinkley Point facility and somewhere near Avonmouth, where there is a national grid switchyard. And I think it's about 40 some odd kilometres of 400 kVA power line. And these are the biggest of the tower pylons that you see across the country. He was saying that a number of his constituents have felt really put upon by the utility company that is proposing to put this in. He's got constituents who are subject to blight, who've had their entire projects put on hold, who are suffering from loss of value, and the utility company does not want to seem to take hold of it. And all he is asking for is a fair and independent method of adjudication and speedy adjudication of the number of rights that have been lost by landowners, including such areas as blight. That usually arises where there is uncertainty about the route. There are other potential areas where it seems at least possible, if not probable, that there will be erosion of proprietorial rights as well. I think that certainly planning use, what you might call permitted development and existing use rights in planning, I think may be set to be challenged. Rights of light is certainly one that developers have consistently said that they stand in the way of development. And my answer to anybody who says we don't want to have common law rights of light, which you may know only entitles you to a very low minimum standard of light within a building, my answer to them is, well, in that case, would you like the British standard daylight and sunlight, which is used by all the town planners? Because that actually produces a much better standard of light and a much more societally holistic approach to daylighting generally than individual common law rights of light. Somebody contacted me the other day about minerals, particularly what you might call special minerals, so things like lithium that are used in manufacturing specialist batteries and that sort of thing, and whether they were going to go down the same road and suddenly that people would find that they had been as it were, accrued to the state for no compensation to the owners of land. Water, which of course we know is a matter of stress in various areas, we could find that that is going to become more of an issue. And I can't help thinking that biodiversity net gain is another area that might end up being claimed as a right to the public at the expense of the individual owner. So that's the end of what I had to say, and I'm sure you've got loads and loads of questions, but that just sets the scene of where I see some of the issues that are coming forward, which affect my profession, particularly as a valuer, but also the rights and entitlements of individuals right the way across the country. So this isn't just business, it's everything from householders to businesses to charities and everything in between. So I'll stop there if that's...
No, fantastic summary, John. It was really interesting because we originally met at a party wall training, but this was more urgent. So when you say power of compulsion, does that mean that these companies now have the ability to compulsory acquire your site, whether you want them or not? Basically,
it does. Yes, basically they have powers. They have powers to insist that you provide them with the necessary interest for them to construct their mast.
Even though they are private companies, they work for profit.
Even though they are private companies, and even if they're based in San Diego.
Yeah, it's quite a good place apparently, San Diego.
Well, I'm sure, but if you're talking about goods for the public interest of the public of the UK and for the society of the UK and for the better facilitating of life in the UK,
yeah.
Why are we having critical bits of infrastructure owned by people who are not necessarily subject to the pressures, political in particular, that people would see as being a necessary control from within this country?
Now, I'm going to bring Rima in a minute, but before I go over to her. So in terms of compulsory purchase and compensation, am I right in understanding that in the UK, the compulsory purchase compensation is lower than the market value, whereas if you compare it with infrastructure projects in France, they tend to compensate above the market value? Is that roughly right?
Yes, it is. That is roughly right, in the sense that following a case known in the trade as the Point Good case, which is of some antiquity now, the whole idea is that the acquiring authority, in paying compensation, the claimant could have no regard to the added value that was created by the scheme itself. There's been, however, a subtle shift here, because in going to what you might call existing use value, which I'm very happy to sort of go into that in more detail, if you like, that means that all sorts of aspirations that may arise in the general market that arises normally, so not the special circumstances of providing telecoms or doing a road scheme or a rail scheme or something like that, but those other circumstances that normally arise as part of the aspirations of the market, my understanding is that those also stand to be painted out of the picture from the point of view of compensation. So there has been a shift, and that's why it's referred to by some of my colleagues as compensation light, because that is how it appears to be working. I think if you want to know what lies behind it, I think probably it's the Treasury. There are obviously millions of pounds invested in the UK infrastructure, and there's going to be a lot more invested as the National Infrastructure Commission starts to move things up a gear. And the Treasury has always tended to err towards a principle of profit foregone. So in other words, if you couldn't establish in money terms that there was a greater value, a greater profit, you didn't get paid it, because it was, you could only get paid for what you had. stands in quite stark comparison with, for instance, the compensation code in France, where they pay you a bit extra. They pay you for things. And there are things under the general compensation code, like farm loss payments and business loss payments and home loss payments in this country as an add-on. But the acquiring private land's interest in private land and property generally happens right the way across the developed world and is not unique to us by any standard. So it does beg the question as to whether we've got towards a situation of diminishing returns. And I think that has consequences if people don't feel that they have a stake in the thing or agency in what is happening, and they are being somehow given less than they think of their proper deserts. That has consequences.
Rima, 54 Act, you've got some questions on that, or what would you like to? You're muted. Only 3 years of saying you're muted, right? Never mind.
No, that was really insightful, John. So I think my questions mainly are sort of when it comes to the telecommunications code and exercising the notices as you have to before you install, or whether you're looking to actually expand on a particular site that's owned by private landlords, or it could be a site that's owned by a petrol station or any business. How do you see the operators actually utilising the notices under the 54 Act to gain the rights that they need to? Because that's the sort of trouble that we see, that people don't really, the operators are not sort of.
The 54 Act, of course, is just simply a statutory continuation of the existing agreement. But as you will know, it's nearly always supplanted by a new agreement, which, if it's not agreed voluntarily, is imposed by the court. And that then sits in lieu of that. The difficulty is always going to be bearing in mind you're talking about existing sites, existing rental setups, and what sits behind the willingness of the lessor to let is often an amalgamation of things which isn't just the money. There may be all sorts of other things. For instance, was there a direct benefit in getting better communications for business tenants on their little industrial site or something of that? Once you get to renewal, that sort of disappears and falls away. So and of course they have these rights which, because you are dealing with effectively a no network world, if they want to increase the number of network operators that are on their mast or the equipment, or expand it, other than the fact that the site might need to be increased in size, they can do that. As far as I can see, they can do that without paying a bean more in the consideration for the land. But if you come to want to redevelop and it's no longer of your interest because your little industrial estate, old as it was, is now ready for a redevelopment, but the last thing you want is a telecoms mast stuck next to 20 residential properties, and that starts to hurt. That starts to be an impediment. And if you think of, a mast array on top of a block of flats, maybe it's a block of flats that needs particular work doing to it for fire protection reasons or something like that, or it's a cladding issue or something like that. And the only way they're going to pay for it is by adding 3 stories on and selling off the penthouses. That might be the only way they do it. But they can't do that because they've got a mast array sitting there. Deal with that. And so I think it is too early at this stage to say what the actual effects are going to be. But if you confer non-recourse rights on commercial entities, the working assumption is that they are going to use those, and they are going to use those to their advantage. What on earth incentive would there ever be for them not to use those advantages? And what chief finance officer in any of these firms would suggest that they somehow concede anything. So commercially, I don't see it. I don't see them doing anything other than grasping as many of the rights as they can under this system.
Yeah, but they're still, as far as I understand, John, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're still required to follow the procedure for renewals under the 54 Act by...
Yes, they are required to follow the procedures for renewal under the 54 Act, but what happens is there is now a considerable gap between, excuse me, what you would know as the O'May rules, which is namely the lease that was granted under the original agreement should, under the renewal, be substantially the same, other than bringing it up to modern standards, as the old one. As I see it, that will no longer hold good.
So are we saying...
Is right.
Are we saying that normally when people talk about the 54 Commercial Act, commercial properties, they associate that with upwards only rent renewal? Are we saying that may no longer be the case, i.e. they'll get an agreement in and then they say, well, we're paying you guys less?
It's always been the case, actually, and Reba will know this, that if the rent has fallen, a court can award a lower rent, and there's been a whole issue about interim rents and this sort of thing. The difficulty here is that we've got an installation sitting on a site. It hasn't gone down in value. It's worth, if anything, more than it was before, because of the ability to share and augment what's sitting on it and what you attach to it. But by force of regulation under the 2017 Telecommunications Code, landowners are being forced to accept something that is much less, and the write-downs are substantial. Now, I think most of the evidence is driven by two factors. One is the renewals, which are coming through, which we probably aren't seeing very many. The other is new agreements, which I suspect are to do with residential developers who want to get better 4G coverage for their residential people, because people want to have 4G coverage. They want their, be able to control their fridges and their heating and their lighting and everything else from an app on their phone, and that's what you need to do that. And that's the way in which people live in the modern world. So it's in their interests to do that, and it's in it. But for somebody who's on an existing, there is nothing in it for them. And if you're talking about the daisy chain, the rollout of a daisy chain of things, for instance, along the road network in rural areas, you'd have to really wonder whether there was anything in it for the provider of a site. And I think that has all the hallmarks of a system failure in terms of the rollout.
As far as sort of the operators are concerned, from when there were no arrangements, there are prescriptive rights there, because the operators have been there for many years. Now it's only really to do with the renewals when they entered into agreements, whereby there are surveyors, of course, who will get involved. And I don't know how much of that you would provide valuation on, as to whether it should go up, the rent, or it should come down, or it stayed the same. But it effectively, Dale, as you highlighted, it's not always in the telecoms industry. It may not always be that it's an upward rent. It could, well, just as John highlighted, stay the same. It
isn't, but in the order of things, as I say, the utility of the mast hasn't gone down. So, in other words, what you might call the original understandings under the agreement have been effectively economically undermined by the process. It's not as if there's been a fall in the value of the mast. It's not.
Yes.
What I say.
And I think considerable increase.
Well, the evidence is that they sold off their portfolio of mast sites for a lot of money to somebody. The ones in San Diego. These are not, poverty-stricken assets.
Yes.
We are talking about things of significant value that are traded, and so I think it's only right to suggest that has been undermined The other thing, of course, doesn't help is that a lot of the modern agreements are subject to confidentiality clauses, non-disclosure agreements,
Yes.
that sort of thing. That has effectively has two effects. It's very difficult to get transparency in terms of the evidence, and although your local agent, and I'm not somebody who deals with telecom mast valuations, I don't deal with that side of the thing at all. But your local agent who deals with telecom masts, may have dealt with lots of these things. Whilst he may be able to say, well, I've been able to do X, Y, and Z agreement, if it comes to evidence before the tribunal and it's got a non-disclosure agreement, how is he going to present that evidence to the tribunal? So basically, his hands are tied behind his back when the chips are down, and the mast site operators know that, and that's how they are playing that. The second thing that it does is the mast site operators can represent more or less whatever evidence, quote unquote, they might wish to produce to government in support of their arguments. And one of the things that we were arguing in the course of this PSTI bill was for the government to produce the evidence. And fundamentally, the government was either not able or unwilling to produce the evidence. It was, and such evidence it was, as it was able to give us as peers, came from surprise, the mast operators side of the industry. So it makes it very difficult. There's a complete lack of transparency, and of course, we've got a lack of transparency. There's a complete lack of trust. Follows on from that.
So in the 54 Act, I think there's usually a provision in any sort of lease for a freeholder that should they wish to redevelop the site, they can have it back. Is that being negated in some manner? That's a rather interesting one, because I think we don't yet know what the situation is, except that the instances where this seems to have occurred, the mast operator by and large says, well, I don't want to move it. You will have to take me on. And again, you get to the asymmetry of economic power and purpose here, because they can effortlessly outgun the private individual. And even if they, because they will bring in the top lawyer, the guy from Landmark Chambers, or whichever of the Inns of Court they wish to do, they will bring in the top people if necessary to establish the point. And they've only got to establish the point on 2 or 3 occasions, and they've then already built up evidence by way of precedent. So the cards are stacked against it. Now, going back to you Dill mentioned the Party Wall Act earlier. The principle behind the Party Wall Act in connection with Section 10 is it tried to get a dispute resolution system that was actually completely neutral as to the economic power of the parties engaged. I think it was rather unique in that sense. But if you're talking about ADR and mediation, well, mediation, firstly, they've got to be some sort of concurrent joint motive to settle, and there's got to be a commonality of purpose and intention here, which I think very often doesn't happen. And if you get to arbitration, well, arbitration can be very expensive. It can be made very expensive, and that is one of the impediments to using it. Arbitration used to be considered a very cheap and an effective way of doing it, because of the legal constructs that have grown up around it. It has become much more demanding, I think, of legal thinking and firepower, and has become accordingly more expensive. And I don't voice that as a criticism any more than I say that the advent of the county courts was supposed to have overcome the issue of having to go to a superior court before the county courts ever existed. And of course, the county courts, they may technically be cheaper, but in fact, you may wait
several years before your case gets to it, by which time you could be broke or dead or both. That becomes a barrier to getting free and equitable means of adjudication. And it's these things are part of the pillars of human rights in relation to property. The reasonable enjoyment of your assets, not to have them taken away by the state except for a really good and justifiable reason, and that where there is where it is taken from you, that you have fair access to a fair and objectively impartial method of compensation, and that if you can't agree that you have access to a fair and impartial and independent form of adjudication. And I see all of those being subject to, certainly they're subject to quite severe stress, if not actually having been undermined. And I think that is one of the things where if you're a valuer and you're looking at this thing on the broad canvas, you would have to say to yourself, well, if you're assessing risk and market sentiment, and market sentiment is key here, because it doesn't matter whether you're HM Treasury or a Department of State or Parliament, none of that can outrun market sentiment. Cannot outrun market sentiment. It just doesn't happen. So market sentiment is key, and valuers, of course, are there to try and work out what's happening in terms of market sentiment. They don't govern the market, contrary to what some people in some of the government departments may think. Valuers sit there, like economists, they try and sit there and understand how the rest of the world is actually functioning in terms of its transactional analysis. That's what we do. And going back to there was the EWS1 system, which was to try and deal with what was a potential market failure post-Grenfell, when people who had cladding or perhaps none didn't know whether their properties could be sold, and mortgage companies didn't know whether they could rely on the thing being free from these defects. And it was an attempt to deal with that. But the government actually didn't like much what RICS and others had put in place to try and deal with this, because it was the mortgage lenders, it was the insurance business, it was consumer stakeholders, it was valuers, it was other professional bodies. They all were brought together to try and hammer this thing out. And when the government said they thought they ought to sort of abandon it, because it was all right, wasn't it? And then the RICS reconvened the group and said, well, actually, no, we think that it's still relevant. That seemed to get up the government's notes, because quick as a flash, it then put into the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill in clause 186, I think it is, a provision that the Secretary of State should reserve powers to investigate, to appoint an independent person to report on RICS governance and purposes. Now, you have to say to yourself, well, what's the Secretary of State doing, poking his or her nose into the business of a membership organisation constituted under Royal Charter and is independent of any political thing? The mind boggles, but it boggled even more because RICS at that particular moment had already commissioned Lord Bishop, Michael Bishop, to carry out a review of its governance and purposes, which he has done. But nevertheless, that provision in clause 186 of the Levelling Up Bill, which hasn't yet reached the House of Lords, I might say, has still got the RICS in its little crosshairs. And one wonders whether, in fact, if you really want a conspiracy theory, whether this business of erosion of rights and valuation principles underpinning property rights is in some way connected with the fact that the RICS is like the custodian of valuation principles. It produces what's known as the Red Book, which is the manual which is used it's of international status that this has, and it's written in conjunction with the international valuation standards, and those standards are understood in Sydney, Australia, to Singapore, to Seattle, and everywhere in between, including the United Kingdom and most of Europe, and that underpins the whole valuation approach. So there is actually, I think, if you like, a professional risk that's sitting behind here. And I don't know how far this is going to run. And I also don't know what the thinking process is that's generated all this. But it would be wrong for me to sit here and say that I'm comfortable about what is happening, because I'm not comfortable, because there are things that are popping up and I see connections between the two which might not be real or might not be intended. But I think in combination, they start to shift market sentiment, and that has real world implications, because if you are dealing with the level of lending against property in this country, which is we have one of the greatest exposures of any country in the developed world, and probably the rest of the world, to property-based lending. If that starts to wobble, then you're talking about the stability of your secondary banking sector, and that affects pensions. It affects all sorts of things. You've only got to see what happens in market. I mean, the classic example was the plan for growth that was published by Liz Truss and her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. Look what happened in market. In reality, nothing really changed, but the entire landscape shifted because people put a different interpretation on it. And if you want to see how you can't outrun independent external worldwide markets, that's a classic example. I think will go down as a classic example of the law of foreseeable but politically unrecognized consequences, and that's the danger of what we are in at the moment.
I think you'll be able to say "I told you so," John, if it came. I mean, hopefully
I hope not, because I don't like people saying people I told you so. I like to say, look, would you kindly listen to me? So
look. To play the devil's advocate, I'm glad you got trust out the way, because I was going to come to that.
But that wasn't within my gift. Bear in mind, I'm an independent crossbench peer. I don't belong to any political party. I merely observe, sometimes with a greater or lesser degree of
what about saying, well, it's for the greater good? We're doing this to bring levelling up, to get infrastructure to the population. We need to do it for the greater good. What about that counteract that we need to
yes, and I buy that, and I think all the peers that were dealing with this telecoms issue were of one mind, that we all thought that the further rollout of 4G and the future rollout of 5G was fundamentally a good thing. It was a desirable objective. We know there's been huge underinvestment in everything from our national grid to our water systems, our road systems. You've only got to look at it. I mean, we're suffering from one sort of congestion or shortage after another. The investment hasn't been there. So despite the privatization, it's not resulted in the further inward investment. We absolutely have to do something about it. I mean, it's going to make us poorer in the process of doing it. So be it. That said, you can't suddenly crank things into reverse after decades, if not centuries, of practice without taking people with you. You can't say, well, that's the way we want to do it, now we're going to do it this way. Any sort of industry and any sort of ongoing investment process that you might wish to consider is absolutely killed stone dead if you suddenly crank the thing into reverse or suddenly change direction. It's a really bad way of doing it, because there's market sentiment and confidence, and the risk is that if your freedom to transact and transact in a way that's free from impediment, that affects market fluidity. It affects all sorts of things from the way in which one would invest, make one's commitment, and indeed, to some extent, accept responsibility for these things. And those are very important underpinning things, and they have been important since the dawn of time, since mankind 10, 12,000 years ago first started getting together and settling in continuous areas of habitation. And so those sort of things, and that sort of transaction and being confident about what you're doing and confident over time risks being undermined. And it's one of the problems that we've faced for a very long time, and that's the political short-termism that's built into this thing. None of these parties, I mean, they talk about saying, oh, well, we want to decarbonise by 2050, but that's several governments away. And in the meantime, it might be several governments of different persuasions away. And I think that there isn't the political consensus between the parties that actually can take this forward. And so if a party is just simply looking to its success at the next election, or perhaps not even its own success and its own credentials, but damaging the other side sufficiently badly in order to make sure that they still get in, however bad the administration may have been to date, is all a really negative way of doing it. And I think when people talk about falls in productivity in this country, I attribute it to that sentiment. I attribute the fact that there are 1 million people who seem to have disappeared post-COVID off the employment payroll, and either taken early retirement or done something else, or decided that they're going to flog their second home and live off the proceeds in the south of France, whatever they decided they want to do. These are not signs of a healthy collaborative desire to build and invest and augment what is happening in this country. This is a sign of retreat. I'll tell you what I heard yesterday at a little seminar I was attending, and that was that in the last published results, Christie's, the fine art auctioneers, had an absolutely bumper year. And this wasn't oligarchs buying stuff. A lot of the oligarchs have been subject to sanctions. This was ordinary people buying stuff, and which I used to know when I was working in the Inland Revenue Valuation Office as portable antiquities, except they may not be antiquities, they may be other works of art or things that just look nice and are attractive to people. It may not be antique at all. But if people are actually moving out of property and that sort of thing into these more portable assets, what does that mean? What does that mean for traceability? What does that mean for investment? Because they're not doing anything, they're not working. They're just a clock or a piece of jewelry that's been stuffed under the floorboards or under the pillow or in a mattress or wherever it is, or buried in the bottom of the garden. God help us if metal detectors become all the rage again. I don't know whether there is any connection there. But what I do know is that there's been a huge growth in what are called very short-term letting. That's particularly, the Airbnb, but it can be holiday lettings, but it can be short-term lettings in areas where there's, high business level of business activity. Westminster is one of the areas. You might go there on holiday, but there are a lot of other things you would go there for. And I think that those very short-term lettings, you've got to think about the product. It's completely oven ready and literally ready to rock and roll on the market if somebody wants to put it on. It's as near to market ready as you can get it. Because if you've been letting it short-term, it's probably in good condition. It's clean. It's nicely furnished. You could show somebody around tomorrow, and they would think that was a good thing to buy. And getting things near money should be telling you something, and it should be telling government something about what's happening. In other words, they're not letting it on ASTs for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And I spoke to a West Country estate agent a few days ago about this whole phenomenon, only because I happen to have some data about short-term lettings from that part of the world, and I needed a comparison for an ordinary assured short-held tenancy type of situation. And I said, I asked how much was the market sentiment driven by some of the chatter on the airwaves, on the political airwaves, about potential better security of tenure for AST things, the removal of what they call Section 21 evictions. I don't like the term eviction. I think it's tendentious. It's a Section 21 termination. Let's get that straight. You know, eviction is something that's generated by people who've got an axe to grind. The potential for security of tenure, and also potentially rent control. Now, the last time that happened on a big scale was in 1963. It started with the Protection of Eviction Act, which was passed immediately by an incoming Labour government, and it was followed in 1965 by the Rent Acts. The entire private rented sector went to sleep for 25 years. Nothing came on the market. It wasn't until the Housing Act 88 and the advent of the assured short-held tenancy that it started to come back to life. That is still in collective market memory. And so what this estate agent was telling me is that there is a real concern about the political chatter on the airwaves that is actually causing people to move into these very short-term, easily and quickly liquidated state and condition of property. And why wouldn't you? If it's your pension, or it's your you want it to pay for your daughter's wedding, or to set up a child in some business, or whatever you might want to do, or for finance, major surgery for a member of the family who's ill and has no health insurance. There are all sorts of reasons why people do that. And if you've got £300,000 or £400,000, £500,000, why wouldn't you invest it in something that you could get your money out easily, was likely to continue to go up in value, might not be spectacular in terms of the yield, will almost certainly hold its value in the long term, in real term? What's there not to like? Now, let's look at it the other way around. Why have we not got, or we are not creating, comparable investment opportunities that would take the place of that and would actually produce something more productive to the general level of GDP in the country? Because really, when you're investing in property, you're recycling money. You're not really making money, in my opinion. It's a recycling operation. It's a service industry. It's not. You're not creating two things where one was produced before. So I think that that raises a real question of policy about where we're going and why we don't have these things. And when you see, going back to my original premise, that there are aspects of property rights that are under attack, don't think that the whole thing couldn't dematerialize and turn itself into something else, because it's very easy to shift your money around the globe. We may not part of the EU anymore, but we can certainly shift our money to the States, to Canada, and lots of places will be very happy to take it in any shape or form. And I always think of the interview that was done with a Chinese industrialist, and he said, "I'm a billionaire in my home country in China." And he was asked why he was investing in assets in the UK, that he appeared to be paying a lot more than he should be. He was paying over the odds to get them, and they weren't earning him very much. And he said, well, the real reason is, I could step out of line in my own country, and although I'm a billionaire, that could be written off overnight because somebody in the Politburo decides I'm no longer a friend of the state, and it's gone. And all my assets could simply evaporate. He said, if I move that into something in the West, where there are established markets, where the rule of law applies, and there is a rules-based system, even if I lose money on it in the short term, it's real money as opposed to money that can just evaporate overnight. I thought that was a really interesting observation.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, you're talking about the flow of money, you fiddle around with property assets, I think, and the way in which they are viewed in market sentiment, actual peril.
Yes, no, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, you talked about market memory of rent controls. I'm going to bring Surinder on it. Surinder, have you got any comments on that?
Well, not rent controls. Well, I think they'll eventually come in anyway, because the way things are going at the moment, the rents are going to go up and up and up. But what I'd like to explain in layman's terms is that, say, a friend of mine has a flat in the West End, which has got a mast outside.
Mm.
Who does that real estate belong to? The leaseholder, the freeholder, or the mast owner?
You're saying when you say a mast outside it, in terms of the
on the building itself,
on the roof of the building or something.
The roof of the building, yeah.
Well, if it's a block of flats, I mean, under the present arrangements in this country, the only way you can enforce positive covenants and negative covenants you can enforce quite easily, but positive covenants you can only enforce in under English law through effectively a leasehold system. I think I'm right in saying that is the only way of dealing with it. So what happens is that the fabric of the building is owned by whoever owns the freehold, typically, of the block. And under that, there are a whole load of subsidiary titles, which are, long leaseholds for whatever it might be, 125 years, maybe more, maybe a bit less. And so they have a lesser title. And of course, the Mast Co has a lease, which effectively is a protected business lease of a bit of the roof of the situation. They've acquired that they've acquired those rights off the freehold. Mm-hmm. Now, the leaseholder doesn't have any more rights over the freeholder's ability to let things for a mast any more than he has any rights to stop the leaseholder adding 2 or 3 stories to the building and making a socking great profit. That is the way of the thing, because it actually lies out with their long leasehold interest, which is just of the apartment that they occupy. And it's a real conundrum because people keep talking about common hold and this sort of thing. And I'm sorry if I'm treading on anybody's toes when it comes to common hold, but it seems to me that common hold needs to contain precisely the same ingredients that long leasehold, the leasehold system, tries to embody at the moment. You've still got a group of individuals who own rights in different bits of the building, and somebody else who has the fabric of the building as a whole. And I've tried to think about this philosophically. I don't know how else you divide the thing up. And certainly the Australians, when they came into strata title, didn't find any better way of dividing it up either. So when people say, well, they don't like leasehold, but I say, well, actually, as a philosophical construct, what else are you suggesting that is radically different? But going back to your point, you as leaseholder would never own, as long leaseholder would never own part of that mast site. You might own it if you were in conjunction with the ownership of your leasehold, a co-owner of the freehold. In other words, you collectively enfranchised, so that you all owned the thing. And therefore you would all, as a collective, as a separate legal entity, as a collective, own the freehold of the mast site. But the provisions of the mast just go on as a separate tenancy, notwithstanding. On owning bits of things in parts. My father always used to love quoting what he referred to as the dictum of Aristotle. And the dictum of Aristotle runs roughly this, and this may not be a perfect translation. It goes, that which is owned in common belongs to nobody. And that should make everybody think rather carefully about things in common. You require a degree of glue, of collective endeavour and collective motivation to make these things work. I mean, I've come across some, leaseholder owned and managed blocks, usually older ones, where you had a small cabal of 3 or 4 of presumably the longest standing residents who had managed to collar the whole management and decision-making process for themselves, to the exclusion of all the others in the block. And you get some bright young thing come along and say, well, I'd like to take part in this. And they would basically get shut in the door. It's an absolute scandal. But, this is not just, nasty freeholder and lovely leaseholder. It can also be, various grades of not very pleasant leaseholder. If it's a shove, and I'm sure you, Rima, have come across loads of situations where that sort of thing applies in all sorts of things as a property lawyer.
When you said sort of, mentioned about the block of building being managed by leaseholders who are the freeholders, and as a lawyer who specialises in property disputes, I sort of hear the alarms going off at that point, because it can be a right mess if the procedures are not followed correctly, especially when it comes to one leaseholder and a freeholder being difficult about service charges, or about, applying it to the telecoms industry, being completely difficult about what the rent should be, and that's a situation we've had. Yes. And it's so
I always think, as I say, this question of dealing with fire safety, and what if the only way of squaring the circle is to build up on you're prevented from doing so because the telecom operator won't move his kit. Says, no, I have rights, that
there is that right now, of course, that they're entitled to it. So it's a case of actually the mechanisms in the middle that get to the point of that can be quite tricky.
I certainly wouldn't mind if the mechanisms were put everybody objectively on an equal playing field, and that's not to say, going back to the rent thing. I'm not a defender of the original rental situations, although they were set by the industry themselves and set by the other players in competition with each other. It should be said, rather than because landowners were turning around saying, no, we're all going to gang up against you. The landowners never did that. They didn't have the ability to gang up against people. So you just have to say to yourself, well, what's going on here? Why isn't there a better balance? Why has government allowed itself to be convinced that there is an imbalance here that forces us to consider swinging the pendulum in completely the opposite direction? And
absolutely.
Is what are the consequences of that, and what is the mood music that people are going to hear as a result of that?
Right, Rima, John, I'm going to have to interrupt you guys. Unfortunately, the clock has beaten us. But look, thank you for your time, John. Will you come back for round 2? Because it's been a fascinating.
I'm very happy to come back for round 2. I'm sure I hope you're going to we've gone on much longer than you told me we were going on. So I imagine there's going to be somebody with a pair of electronic scissors that's going to give a certain amount of this on the electronic cutting room floor.
Time flies when you're having fun, John. So
it's been great. It's been a great conversation, and thank you for those sort of searching questions. You may not agree with what I have to say, but I'm looking at the thing as a as a philosophical good. Where do we go from here? And if nobody,
it's a much wider perspective, John, that you've brought to this discussion here, because as in the legal world, you're looking at the laws that have been implemented, and you're assisting, whether it's claimants or lessees or lessors, you're assisting them with the mechanisms that are in place and the bills that have been passed that have converted to laws. But here we've discussed a wider perspective as to what things should be, can be, and could be, and the progressions that we've made. So it's been very insightful. So thank you very much.
No, it's been my pleasure.
And we look forward to part 2 and talking about the Party Wall Act in one of these conversations.
Can I wait till 2023?
Well, probably will do, actually. Yeah, very good, very sharp, John. Very sharp. Right, Surinder.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
for being here for
Thank you.
us. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you on the next one.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Have a good season. Bye now.
Same